I mean, 4:30, wow, for these important substantive conversations. So I propose that we launch, that you and Lisa do anything you need to do by way of preliminaries, and then I will very quickly move through the draft agenda, or the agenda, and we'll get underway.
I'm good with that. What do you got, Lisa? Anything important?
No, I'll just pass it over to Linda for a quick update. And other than that, I don't think we need to talk about how the call works anymore. We pretty much have everyone we know on here.
Agreed.
So Linda, if you wanted to, is that right for the agenda, Mike? I'm sorry, I don't have.
Yeah, we were going to skip agenda, any updates, and jump into the content. But if Linda, you have something that is related to the content they're about to get, you're going to get the floor in about 2 seconds anyway. So can we do it all together?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Janine has alerted you all that the recording is on, so you are being recorded.
Yay.
And here's the agenda. Again, this is a change from some of you may have seen the preliminary agenda. Bonnie and Tom were wanted to make sure on behalf of the CAG that tonight's agenda was used for the important substantive content that is in play, that is out for public comment, and that we move fast through these preliminary items. So here's the agenda. You're all are going to be muted, me included, while there is a presentation of the North Boundary Barrier Wall Containment System evaluation. There will be no interruption or discussion because the goal is to move then immediately to another presentation of the conceptual site model, at which point Janine will hinder us, and we will give as much possible time to the CAG for question, answer, discussion. And I have a couple of words of advice about how we do that. One topic at a time, and two, it would be great to know what section you're in or what page number you're on. So if you can pull up the conceptual site model document and point to the place where you are before you begin to make a comment or add a question, that would be amazing. There is a nice reciprocity here. The WSDs and the regulators don't get to decide what you ask, but on the other hand, the reciprocity is that you don't get to decide what they answer. So it's possible you will hear, we have to review that, or that goes in the public comment and we will need to review it before we answer. And that is what it is. So we'll move as briskly, but as deeply as we can through the substance of it. And away we go. So Janine?
Someone just got on the meeting, their name is Talks Call. Can you let me know who you are, please? Talks Call?
Yes, sorry, I just renamed myself. This is Andrea Kincaid with CDPHE.
Very good, thank you so much.
Sure, sorry about that.
No worries. I'm gonna mute everyone.
Wait, I have a question.
Unless you have a question, but I was also gonna say, so whoever is gonna start, just remember to unmute yourself. Please go ahead, Margie.
Yes, I was just going to say I can sort of understand why we're taking the approach we're taking tonight, but since we're being asked to pull up a certain page in a document before we ask a question, I just think it would have been nice if we had known about that ahead of time so that perhaps we could have been a little bit more prepared.
Okay, so it will help point if you have it, not if you don't. No harm, no foul.
And
okay.
the links to the two documents were in the email sent out with the agenda in case you want to quickly find that.
No, that's fine. I know where the documents are. It's just to have the page number ready that was just.
Yeah, no, just where you are in the document if you can. That's all. It was to help navigate.
If you have it.
Yeah, best you can. Okay.
Mike,
so,
Mike, can you possibly pull up the pages? Because I have no idea how to pull up a page and show it.
Yeah. Oh, no, I was just asking when you make a comment, if you can say, I'm in section 8 on page 7 of section 8, and my comment is thus.
Okay.
It was a little advice. It's supposed to be a throwaway. Okay. So Janine, away we go. Mute us all now. Linda, the floor is yours. So set the stage and get these two presentations in our lap.
Okay, so I just had a couple, well, I guess I'm not going to call them announcements, but things to say about the public review periods that are happening right now. So the first is that the 5th five-year review process has started, and the contractor who worked on the last 5-year review is the same one that's doing this 5-year review. Their name's Skio. And we were able to have a site inspection on May 10th, despite all the mud and the rain. And we had some people who hadn't seen the site before, like Andrea Kincaid, come to see the site. And so it was a really good inspection. From that, Skio will start sending out community interview forms and contacting people, the options to comment on give information to be used in the 5-year review is now. Skio will be conducting group interviews and also giving the option to provide written comments based on an interview form. So those, some of the stakeholders have received them already. If you haven't, contact Lisa McLean Vanderpool and we'll make sure that you get an interview form. Any questions or concerns that have been submitted between April and June 22nd will be considered part of those public comments for the 5-year review, and we'll respond to them in writing after the 5-year review is finalized. Let's see, and those forms are due back by June 22nd. And then as our topics for today, we are in the public review period for the conceptual site model and the north boundary barrier wall containment system evaluation. That review period started May 5th, and it was a 30-day review. The CAG members requested an additional 30 days, so that was granted. So those comments are due back to me by July 6th. So they would just be emailed to kiefer.linda@epa.gov. And any comments received between April and July 6th that are pertinent to those documents will be considered for those documents. Providing written comments assures that we'll have greater public awareness and transparency, and everybody can see everyone's comments in the 5-year review or in the consolidated comments that'll come back for the other 2 documents. And that's all I had. So I know the WSDs worked really hard to get these video presentations ready for today. They will be available through a link on our website and probably CDPHE. We're still working that out. And so anyone in the public can review them on demand as a companion to the 2 documents we're going to see about today. So that's all.
Michael, this is Bonnie. Did you say we can't ask any questions?
Yeah, these were gonna roll. The first one was supposed to be uninterrupted because
I'm talking about the update. I'm talking about the update we just received.
Oh. Sure.
I didn't know we were going to have any of that. Anyway, could you please repeat your information about transparency?
Right, by receiving written comments, then and to one person, which is me, I'm able to manage them, have them make sure that they're either in the 5-year review or when we look at the public review comments for the conceptual site model in the CSM, we'll make sure that they go appropriate place and we can respond to those comments, and then there'll be a written record of that. So we're requesting that people submit their comments in writing to us.
Okay, so will there be no information whatsoever on how your collaboration with CDPHE and Tri-County, will there be nothing that can be looked at by the public when you're talking about transparency? How can we see the discussions and what each entity's comments were so that we can come to our conclusions about how this was come to a decision.
Well, I'll have to get back to you on that one. I'd have to talk to CDPHE
And Tri-County, right? Because you're all in collaboration, is that correct?
no, we are not in collaboration. On these two documents that you're going to see today, we worked together to make sure that everyone's comments were incorporated on that from the agencies, and that's what you see in that product. Those meetings, we do not have any of those meetings scheduled for the future. So EPA will be writing the comments back on the comments that you submit. And we might ask for advice from CDPHE or the WSDs or Tri-County, but that just depends on the situation if we need some advice on that, but there isn't any formal process for it right now.
Okay. Is it necessary to, in order to understand how you came to agreement, is it necessary for us to do a FOIA?
If you have a specific,
You're off.
okay, am I back?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, if you have a specific question, EPA prefers that people submit FOIAs so that we can track our requests and our time that we spend on them through Congress. So yes, that is a preferred way to request information from us.
Okay, we would like to see any written comment from Tri-County Health and CDPHE. And so if we need to do a FOIA, we'd like to do that. If there is no written comment, then we're having trouble with understanding how this is a collaboration which benefits the public.
Okay, I'll send you a link to the FOIA, how to request a FOIA.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Presentation on the barrier wall evaluation.
Okay, Mike, I'll share my screen and then go ahead and play it.
Dan, I accidentally muted you, but my apologies. Dan? There
Sorry,
you go.
took me a
There you
minute to
are.
find the unmute. Okay, here we go.
Hello, my name is Tim Shangra. I'm a principal engineer with Engineering Management Support, Inc., and I've managed cleanup of
Dan, I
Did we
think
lose sound?
you can't mute, maybe.
I'm sorry, what?
I think when you are muted, your screen is also muted for the group.
Oh, sorry about that. I'll back up.
Management Support, Inc., and I've managed cleanup of the Lowry Landfill Superfund site since 1984. I'm familiar with the design, construction, and operations of the north boundary barrier wall, and I'm also familiar with the effectiveness of the north boundary barrier wall that is the subject of this presentation. So in this presentation, I would like to provide a general overview of the north boundary barrier wall system, a brief history of system operations, and discuss the effectiveness evaluation that was required by EPA's 2017 5-year review. First, I should stress that the evaluation was conducted collaboratively by the work settling defendants consultants, EPA, and CDPHE. All of the participants concluded that the north boundary barrier wall effectively contains or stops the flow of contaminated groundwater in the alluvium and upper weathered portion of the bedrock as specified in EPA's record of decision for the site. Specifically, hydraulic containment is being achieved by the north boundary barrier wall system. Contaminants do not migrate over, under, around, or through the north boundary barrier wall system. and remedial action objectives are being met by the system as well. No additional data are needed to evaluate the system effectiveness, and no additional actions are needed to meet the remedial action objectives. So first, where is the system located? North boundary barrier wall is located at the north end of the site, down gradient from buried waste disposed of in the landfill mass and disposed in these waste pits. The system is constructed to intercept the northern movement of contaminated groundwater beneath the unnamed creek alluvium this way. The north boundary barrier wall components consist of the north boundary barrier wall, a collection drain with a sump in front of the wall, and extraction well MW170 EW1. Throughout this presentation, I use the term north boundary barrier wall system to address these three components. North of this north boundary barrier wall system are a formerly used injection trench, formerly used injection wells, and currently used extraction wells that are intended to remove residual contamination from north of the wall. The wall itself is comprised of a compacted clay barrier that's constructed through alluvium, colluvium, and weathered sandstone, all the way down to and keyed into unweathered bedrock. Groundwater migrates from south to north. This barrier wall stops migration northward. In front of the wall, the groundwater is then collected through a gravel drain that also is equipped with a sump. And then on top of that drain is another compacted clay layer, which prevents infiltration of surface water into the drain. During normal operations, groundwater surface is lowered up gradient of the wall to the base of weathered bedrock, and down gradient of the wall, the water table has declined somewhat because of lack of recharge. But we still have a reverse gradient. This is the benefit, a reverse gradient from north to south that promotes the potential for groundwater movement back toward the sump from north of the wall. Historically, between 1984 and 2001, effluent from the old water treatment plant, which was only designed to remove VOCs, was released to the injection trench. That effluent contained 1,4-dioxane. Then in 2001, the new water treatment plant came online, and that plant is designed to remove both VOCs and 1,4-dioxane. Its effluent is released to the Metro Wastewater Reclamation Treatment Facility in North Denver. Potable water was then injected into the injection trench, largely to address water rights augmentation requirements. In 2011, potable water injection location changed from the injection trench to these 3 injection wells. And then in 2018, potable water injection ceased entirely in response to EPA's 5-year review requirement. Injection has not resumed. So the containment system evaluation addresses the ability of the north boundary barrier wall system to effectively contain contaminated groundwater migrating from the Superfund site and prevent contaminant migration beyond the compliance boundary. The first step involved identifying the target zone of containment. Now in this picture, we show the boundary of the Superfund site. We also show the groundwater compliance boundary, and of course, the north boundary barrier wall and extraction wall MW170 EW1. The target zone of containment is basically shown here, and it is positioned in front of the wall and extends to and beyond the extraction well. It encompasses the entire width of the 1,4-dioxane plume, and that is defined by 0.9 micrograms per liter contour here and here, which is a performance standard for 1,4-dioxane for the site. So the approach involved examining 5 lines of evidence. The first 2 involved use of a 3-dimensional numerical flow model to evaluate the potential for flow over, under, around, or through the wall. Groundwater flow vectors and particle tracking simulations were modeled both with and without potable water injection. The other 3 lines of evidence consisted of reviewing historical water quality data to 1, Assess the quality of groundwater up gradient versus down gradient of the wall. 2, to examine a time concentration plot of data from a key well down gradient of the wall to show how cleanup of residual contamination is occurring without interference from contribution from an up gradient source. And then 3, a simple comparison of mass flux approaching the north boundary barrier wall system to mass flux being removed by the system. So the numerical flow model used was a 3-dimensional finite element model that was assembled and calibrated by CDM Smith in collaboration with the MSI, EPA, and CDPHE. Flow vectors were used to identify the direction of groundwater flow in the alluvial weathered bedrock hydrogeologic units. The size of the arrows indicates the relative magnitude of groundwater flow. In other words, the large arrows show areas where groundwater flow rates are higher, as opposed to the smaller areas, which indicate where more limited groundwater flow occurs. Now, as shown on this figure, groundwater flow converges or flows toward the north boundary barrier wall and extraction well MW170 from the south, from the west, and from the east. All arrows within the plume, the boundaries of the plume, are also converge toward the wall and the extraction well. North of the wall, very little movement occurs, as indicated by the very small arrows, largely because the wall cuts off flow north of the wall. I should note that these flow vectors are similar in direction and size when we examine both potable water operations with and without potable water injection. This slide shows the simulation of flow paths of particles that approach the north boundary barrier wall system from the site using a method called particle tracking. Tracks in this figure show that all particles along this transect, and in particular those within the boundaries of the plume, are captured by the north boundary barrier wall system. The particle tracks are under steady state condition, meaning that over an unlimited time period, the particles will follow these tracks. Subsequent slides show how far the particles tracks at various time steps, just for point of reference. So after 3 months, particles are approaching the wall but haven't reached the wall yet. After 6, start to reach the wall. After 1 year, more are reaching the wall. Same with 2, same with 4, and then after 8 years, looks like all the particles from immediately in front of the wall have reached the wall. Interestingly, the particle tracks over by MW170 haven't quite reached that well yet, indicating that it's just going to take more time to get there. So the flow velocity basically in this area very small, very low. With regard to flow under the wall, the model indicated the rate of migration through unweathered bedrock was extremely low, many orders of magnitude slower than the rate of movement through the overlying alluvium and weathered bedrock. In other words, travel beneath the wall would require many decades to hundreds of years to occur. From a practical perspective, modeling indicated that the rod required objective of capturing contaminated groundwater migrating through the alluvium and weathered bedrock is being achieved. So the next series of slides now examine the evaluation of groundwater quality in the north boundary barrier wall area. This slide shows a large number of wells that are used, like 40 to 50 wells, that were monitored to assess the quality of groundwater in the north boundary barrier wall area. The wells were sampled to define the types and concentrations of chemicals that are present up gradient, side gradient, and down gradient of the wall. The results showed that VOCs and 1,4-dioxane are present above performance standards up gradient of the wall, but only 1,4-dioxane exceeds its performance standard down gradient of the Superfund site. So we used 1,4-dioxane as a tracer compound or chemical of concern to examine both spatial distribution and time concentration data in the down gradient well. Next series of slides show the spatial distribution of 1,4-dioxane approaching the wall, around the wall, and down gradient of the wall. And this slide is really interesting in that we see very high concentrations of 1,4-dioxane approaching the wall, greater than 900 micrograms per liter, but do not extend beyond the wall. We have a large contrast between upgrading and downgrading concentrations in this area, say on the order of a magnitude, which really indicate that the wall is effective at capturing mass. We also recognize that there is a halo of lower concentrations north of the wall, in this area here. And these concentrations are indicative of a stagnation zone north of the wall where there is very little groundwater movement, as shown in the previous modeling slide. The 1,4-dioxane likely originated from before the wall was constructed and or from 17 years of injection of treated effluent in the injection trench that contained 1,4-dioxane. North of the wall, the aerial distribution is also showing very low concentrations where localized pumping is occurring, which brings me to the next line of evidence, that of time concentration trends from a compliance well north of the wall. Specifically, I'm referring to compliance well B326. We chose this well because this well has the most extensive 1,4-dioxane data set from wells north of the wall, and its initial dioxane concentrations were the highest of wells north of the wall. Adjacent to this well are two extraction wells, MW113WD and MW113EW1. 113 was an initial well that pumped at a relatively slow rate. It was upgraded to this EW1 well, which pumped at a higher rate. And I'll show you the significance of the change in pumping in a later slide. So now I want to talk about the time concentration relationships of the data from this B326WD well. This is a log scale plot of the data with the concentrations on the vertical scale, time frame on the horizontal scale show relative to the groundwater performance standards here. And I want to walk through 5 segments of this curve to show how operations associated with the response actions impacted the quality of groundwater in this well. The first segment is basically without groundwater extraction. So between 2003 and 2007, we had a fluctuation of between 100 and 1,000 micrograms per liter, again, without extraction occurring, but with potable water injection occurring into the injection trench. Once we brought the first well online, we saw a significant decline in concentrations down to about 8 micrograms per liter in 2011. Also occurring during this time frame was injection in the injection trench, potable water injection up to about that point, and then the change of potable water injection to the injection wells at about this point. We found that was working. The extraction system was working well. Concentrations were coming down, so we upgraded the system using a larger well, but it took about a year to bring that new well online during the year during which the constant pumping was ceased. So we had some rebound up to about 15 micrograms per liter. Then a pretty sharp decline, and then between here and here, we tried to better remove the mass of contamination that was occurring within the sands in the 326 area by changing the rates of extraction and changing the rates of injection. And as the concentration was starting to come back down again, we're showing good progress. Then at this point, potable water cessation, discontinued, ceased, and we had a slight rebound up to about 12 micrograms per liter, largely due to the absence of dilution water from the injection. Then in the fourth quarter of last year, we saw a decline again. We believe this is attributed to a combination of lowering of the water table in the 326 area and inducing fresh groundwater to flow into that area from the surrounding area, thus diluting or displacing the mass in that B326 sand channel. The overall message in this series of sequences is twofold. One, that the response actions have been very effective at lowering the dioxane concentrations north of the wall. And secondly, with regard to the north boundary barrier wall effectiveness, But the time series plots are also consistent with what one would expect to see without a new source of 1,4-dioxane entering the 326 area. So that was a pretty strong line of evidence. And the last line of evidence is mass balance evaluation, where we examine the mass that was approaching the wall versus the mass that was being removed by the wall. These are roughly the same numbers, certainly within the accuracy of the calculation. So we concluded that the north boundary barrier wall is removing the 1,4-dioxane that is migrating toward the wall. So all of these lines of evidence brought us to the conclusions that, one, only 1,4-dioxane is present both south and north of the wall at concentrations of concern. Two, that concentrations, that containment is being achieved by the north boundary barrier wall system. Three, that contaminants do not migrate over, under, around, or through the wall. Four, that remedial action objectives are being met by the north boundary barrier wall system. And lastly, no additional data are needed to evaluate the system effectiveness, and no additional actions are needed to meet the remedial action objectives. That ends my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Okay, so that was the end of the CSC presentation. Do you want me to go straight to the CSM presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and pull that up. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the video player only allows me to have one open at a time.
We learned a lot about the limits of this technology.
Yeah, it's not.
And stop using it.
Okay, so here it comes. And I won't mute myself this time. Hello, my name is Dan Griffiths. I'm a geologist and technical director for groundwater restoration with Parsons in Denver. I'm also the supervising contractor for the Lowry landfill site. I helped EPA and CDPHE and Tri-County Health prepare the conceptual site model update, and I'm familiar with the contents of the CSM and the site in general. In this presentation, I'll provide an overview of the CSM process and the site CSM's role in helping manage impacted sites, when and why CSMs are updated, and I'll spend the latter half of this presentation providing a brief overview of the Lowry landfill CSM update document specifically. I'd like to start by acknowledging all of the parties that contributed to the preparation of the CSM update, and then I'll present the conclusions and findings reached through the CSM update process. The CSM update document was prepared as a collaboration between EPA and CDPHE, Tri-County Health, and the WSDs, as well as each entity's contractors, including Tetra Tech, PWT, CDM, EMSI, and Parsons. To summarize the CSM update process, the CSM and the recent update are illustrative summaries of the site's key aspects, which is designed to help the community and stakeholders visualize and understand site information. The CSM does not assess remedy effectiveness and does not change previous EPA decisions. Now, the CSM update was completed using a top-down approach. We compiled regional data like USGS and CGS reports and updated maps from the Front Range region. Then we looked at local data, including regional boring logs, groundwater data, and surface water data, and then combined that with site data, including data collected from the Lowry landfill site as well as the north end, and some geologic and hydrogeologic modeling to develop a holistic understanding of the site and the region around the site. The updated CSM is similar, although more detailed than previous versions of the CSM. And one of the focal points of the CSM process, and this CSM update in particular, is the presentation of results of historic and more recent risk assessment documents. On-site and off-site risk assessments have found that there's no risk to people or the environment on-site at Lowry or off-site in the north end. So what's a site conceptual model? A site conceptual model, or CSM, is a document that is designed to graphically illustrate everything we know about the site. The CSM is a living document and it has a life cycle. CSMs are typically formulated during the site remedial investigation phase and are formalized during the remedy selection and included in the record of decision. Following the record of decision, the CSM doesn't just go sit on a shelf and collect dust. It continues to be updated as we learn more about the site or as site conditions change. For example, CSMs are typically updated after remedial actions defined in the ROD are completed, because site conditions and risk profiles typically change pretty radically with the implementation of site remedy. During the long-term monitoring, operations, and maintenance phase of a site, the CSM is typically updated every 5 years or so, or as needed to incorporate changes in conditions or to add significant new data sets. The current Lowry CSM was prepared to fulfill a recommendation from the previous 5-year review completed in 2017. Following the fourth 5-year review, a significant body of information was collected, particularly to the north of the site, but also on-site and regionally, that improved the site conceptual model. The CSM update that the community is reviewing now reflects the current understanding of the site and the region surrounding the site. The graphic at the bottom of this slide shows that the life cycle of a CSM, and as you can see, there are a number of major developmental stages in the CSM life cycle. For example, the Lowry site was at stage 3 in 1992, with the completion of the remedial investigation documents, and at stage 4 in 1994 with the completion of the site record of decision. The site continues remedial action operations and maintenance, which is stage 5 of the CSM life cycle. As I stated previously, the current CSM update was prepared as a joint effort by EPA, CDPHE, Tri-County Health, and the WSDs. EPA's contractors, PWT and Tetra Tech, were tasked with writing the draft with support from CDM Smith with the graphics and visual aids. And then Parsons and the WSDs finalized the draft for public preview with input from all the regulatory agencies. Going forward, EPA will lead the preparation of responses to public comments and finalization of the CSM update document with support from CDPHE, Tri-County Health, and the WSDs. The CSM update incorporates all the historic information from the site and surrounding area, including the historic remedial investigations, information from the previous decision documents, data and interpretations from the previous 5-year review documents, and all of the monitoring data from the site status reports that have been prepared over the last 20 years or so. More recent data from the site that has been added includes the 3DBA modeling work, data collected during the 2018 synoptic sampling event, and the North End investigation, and also the portable water injection cessation pilot test. Most recently, each of the remedial components at Lowry have been assessed to determine remedial component effectiveness, and this information was added to the CSM in addition to the findings of the recently completed North End risk assessment. All this information, new and old, was combined, interpreted, and presented in the CSM update document. This is a lot of information, which has resulted in a relatively large document with a lot of figures and illustrations. The information in the CSM update is organized into sections. Each section focuses on an aspect of the site, starting with a description of the site background and history, including disposal practices that led to known environmental impacts we're managing now, and then building into geology, hydrogeology, contaminant nature and extent, bait and transport, and remedial components, and also summaries of the on-site and off-site risk assessments. Each section was updated with new information to formulate the CSM update. The CSM update document is designed to be graphically based, containing 50 figures and 29 illustrations, as well as tables and text to convey complex technical concepts as clearly as possible. Examples of some of the illustrations are included to the right-hand side of this slide, where we show a conceptual cross-section of the site where disposal activities were ongoing, and then later after disposal stopped and the landfill had been capped. The top-down approach was used to update the CSM. We started with the big picture by reviewing and incorporating information regionally from reports, maps, and data from the United States Geological Survey and the Colorado Geological Survey, as well as others. This regional view is depicted in the green box on the air photo to the right-hand side of this slide. We then zoomed into the local view, depicted as the yellow box, in the figure to the right, and reviewed available boring logs and sampling data from surrounding sites and wells. And the final step to the CSM update process was to review and incorporate all the new data from the site itself, as well as the north end. This area is depicted as the orange box. In this way, we prepared a holistic CSM update that incorporates as much information as possible to ultimately arrive at a better understanding of the site. This slide provides an overview of the region around the Lowry site, including identification of surrounding sites. Noted in blue in the upper left corner of the air photo on the right is Buckley Air Force Base. The red triangle immediately to the right of Buckley is the closed Highway 30 landfill that was historically operated by the city of Aurora. Immediately north of Lowry landfill, outlined in green, is the Section 31 landfill, and to the right of it, in purple, is the Denver Arapahoe disposal site. And finally, the last is a small yellow site, which is the E470 Toll Plaza B. Finally, there are a number of septic systems in use at households in the area as well. Focusing on Lowry landfill, the landfill was operated for approximately 15 years, from 1965 to 1980, as a municipal and industrial waste landfill. During this time period, Lowry accepted and disposed of liquid and solid waste from a variety of contributors in accordance with waste disposal practices and regulations of the time. In 1980, Lowry stopped accepting liquid waste and operated for another 10 years, accepting municipal solid waste only. The landfill stopped accepting waste and was closed in 1990, and the record of decision was signed and issued in 1994, which specified a series of mutually supporting remedial components to contain waste in place on site and prevent exposure to those contained wastes. Here you see a generalized cross-section of the sedimentary bedrock units beneath the Front Range, including the Lowry site and the surrounding area. The approximate location of the site is shown on the cross-section. The sedimentary rocks beneath the Lowry landfill site consist of predominantly fine-grained siltstones and claystones and mudstones of the Denver Arcos, which is underlain by the Denver Formation, the Arapahoe Formation, and the Laramie Formation, and ultimately the Pierre Shale. Groundwater flow within the Dawson and Denver occurs predominantly in fractured bedrock, bedding plains, and intermittent sand lenses. And as a result, these aquifer units are relatively slow groundwater producers compared to the deeper formations. Most of the productive water wells are screened in the Arapahoe Formation or deeper. Now, it's important to understand where the silts, clays, and sands that make up the bedrock beneath Lowry came from. The figure in this slide comes from a Colorado Geological Survey map set published in 2013 and depicts the source of the bedrock that underlies Lowry. During the Cretaceous epoch, approximately 60 million years ago, the mountains to the west of the site, shown in dark gray on this map, were uplifting and eroding. The soil and rocks that were eroding off these volcanic highlands were transported by rivers to the east and laid down as bedrock beneath what is now the Lowry site. The modern day Front Range is home to a large productive gold, molybdenum, and silver mines, and, not surprisingly, the rock beneath Lowry and the surrounding area naturally contains relatively high concentrations of metals like molybdenum, arsenic, and silver. This slide shows the 3DVA three-dimensional view of 1,4-dioxane concentrations in groundwater beneath the Lowry landfill site. 1,4-dioxane is an excellent indicator to show lateral and vertical extent of groundwater impacts, as shown by the 3DVA model in this slide. Other VOCs were also modeled using 3DVA, and that information is available in the modeling report. You can see on this figure the soil wall going around the southwest, south, and southeast sides of the landfill, as well as various groundwater extraction systems. The 1,4-dioxane plume depiction is based on a model interpretation of the 2018 groundwater dataset. The colors you see represent different concentrations of 1,4-dioxane, with the red color indicating higher concentrations beneath the site, and the greens and blues depicting lower concentrations at the plume edges. As you can see in the slide, the lateral extent of 1,4-dioxane is contained primarily within the site boundary, with the exception of the north end or down gradient side of the site. Take note of the NW38 extraction system on the northwest side of the site and the north boundary barrier wall pumping system at the north end of the site. The green blobs for the north are the north end offsite plume. Another feature to note is in this top right depiction, which shows the vertical extent of the 1,4-dioxane plume and the wells below the plume where 1,4-dioxane has not been detected. These clean, deeper wells are what bounds the 1,4-dioxane plume vertically, much like clean wells outside of the plume bound the plume edges laterally. The north end 1,4-dioxane plume I mentioned on the previous slide is depicted in plan view on the map to the right of this slide. This map comes from the CSM update document and matches with the plume map depicted in the most recent second half 2020 SSR. As is presented in the CSM update, the SSRs, and the north end report, this plume extends approximately 8,000 feet north of Yale and follows the weathered bedrock channel associated with the Murphy Creek drainage. The 1,4-dioxane concentration within the plume extends as deep as about 50 feet below ground surface, and this plume is bounded laterally and vertically with unimpacted wells, as presented in detail in the North End Investigation Report and the SSRs. 1,4-dioxane concentrations are measured quarterly in the North End wells, and concentrations are going down over time, indicating that groundwater quality is improving. No other contaminants have been detected at concentrations above performance standards in North End wells. The groundwater monitoring sampling continues at the North End wells as defined in the North End Groundwater Monitoring Plan, and results are reported twice a year in the SSR documents. The remedy for Lowry landfill is a containment remedy, wherein the ROD specifies a series of remedial components that work together to contain contaminants on site and prevent exposure from these contained materials. The remedy consists of a series of remedial components, starting with the landfill cap pictured in brown on this slide. Next is the landfill gas recovery system, which is the black dots connected by the purple lines, which represent gas extraction lines, landfill gas extraction lines. And then there's a slurry wall with supplemental pumping, indicated in yellow, going around the southwest, south, and southeast sides of the site. There's a surface water removal action depicted as the blue polygon in the center of the site, and former tire pile waste pit closures, which are the brown crosshatch polygons to the right of the surface water removal action. The north end, north boundary barrier wall on the north end of the site extracts groundwater and prevents impacted water from migrating further north off-site. And the north toe extraction system, pictured as the line just south of the surface water removal action, extracts water from the landfill toe. The MW38 sand channel extraction system is pictured in the northwest corner of the site. And finally, there's the north end response action pumping, depicted in the purple polygons with the red dots in it, north of the north end. The next three slides present the results of the on-site risk assessment that was completed in 1992-1993. On this slide, the analysis of risks associated with operable units 1 and 6, which includes shallow groundwater, subsurface liquids, and deep groundwater, determined that the defined risk pathways were incomplete, as indicated by the red X's, showing that each potential risk pathway is not complete and the receptor associated with that pathway is not impacted. Thus, the contaminants present in these operable units do not pose an unacceptable risk to defined receptors on site. The content presented in this slide and the next two slides is discussed in the CSM update document and in the original risk assessment documents. This slide presents the results of the historic on-site risk assessment and includes analysis of risks associated with operable units 2 and 3, which includes landfill solids and landfill gas. The risk assessment determined that the defined risk pathways for use 2 and 3 were incomplete, again, as indicated by the red X's. Thus, the contaminants present in these operable units do not pose an unacceptable risk to defined receptors on the site. As in the previous slide, the content presented in this slide is discussed in the CSM update document and in the original risk assessment documents. And finally, this slide presents the results of the on-site risk assessment and the analysis of risk associated with operable units 4 and 5, which includes soil, sediments, and surface water. And as you can see, much like the two slides we just looked at, The original on-site risk assessment determined that the defined risk pathways were incomplete for these OUs, as indicated by the red X's. And again, this indicates that the receptors associated with these risk pathways are not being impacted. Thus, the contaminants present in these operable units do not pose an unacceptable risk to defined receptors on site. The content presented in the slide can be found in much greater detail in the original 1992-1993 risk assessment documents and in the recent CSM update document. The recently completed North End risk assessment, prepared by EPA risk assessors, assessed potential risk related to the contaminants in groundwater detected off-site in the North End. This risk assessment was focused on 1,4-dioxane, but also considered potential risk associated with other contaminants that have been detected in off-site groundwater, even at concentrations that are less than performance standards. The North End risk assessment determined that the cancer risk associated with exposure to groundwater within the defined 1,4-dioxane plume is less than 6 in 1 million. And the total risk associated with exposure to groundwater within the 1,4-dioxane plume is less than 7 in 1 million. These calculated risks are below the EPA risk range, and thus the risk assessment concluded that there was no unacceptable risk to people in the North End. And this concludes this presentation on the CSM. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, indeed. So there you go. We can stop the share. So Bonnie and Tom, the floor belongs to the CAG for questions, your own discussion. Away we go.
Well, I'm not sure where we begin. Number one, I couldn't understand half of what was said. That was hard. And so I'm going to have to go back and watch the YouTube presentation to get some of the points I couldn't decipher. I don't know if I'm not in a position right now, but to really comment on what we heard tonight till I go back to YouTube, put my earbuds in and try and understand what was said. I'm disappointed. And I don't know how Tom received all that, but it's going to take me some time, and that's why we asked for an extension of our comment period. So we could go back and review. I would like to ask Dietrich, could you hear everything that was said in these presentations, Dietrich? Were you okay with everything? Is there anything that you need from this presentation to help you move forward for us?
Well, I was able to follow it pretty well. Conceptual site models do follow a pretty generic model. I would point out in my review of it, and if you guys prepare materials going forward with this, I would really recommend it. Typically, as most of us know, in Superfund, site is defined as the extent of the contaminant. And that would include that North End. We could speak of historic facility as the landfill footprint itself. The site and the historic facility information throughout the CSM is somewhat convoluted. You really have to it's a hard slog to keep that separated. And I do see that happening in the document. And I can see where Bonnie's complaint from the discussion we just had, it does make it a little bit challenging for us that have followed this for a few years. And I think that the terminology needs to be consistent. It needs to be consistent with Superfund. So that would be one of my first overview things as we start our review. And I think that kind of reflects what you're hearing from Bonnie.
So let me check, were others able to hear the full presentation? Sound is okay?
Well, I couldn't hear it well. The problem is, guys, that when you're trying to understand what a technical person is saying to you as a layperson, every word matters. And much of it was cut out, and for me. And so like I say, I will go back and put my earbuds in and see if I can hear any better to hear the presentation. And I have to say, I'm still very confused by how the North End investigation got involved in the Superfund site study. And I'm still very concerned about the North End being the focus of attention when the real threat lies within Section 6, within the point of compliance, with 138 million gallons of chemical waste still there. And so I'm having trouble finding out how a conceptual site model can just totally leave the most dangerous part behind and go out past, it's not even described as a Superfund site, and yet we're out there spending money and investigating rather than investigating within the point of compliance and making sure it's in compliance within the point of compliance. So I still have real confusion over how we got way down there at the North End and how we have a risk assessment down there and everything, and how EPA is spending money down there. I know it's because things are off-site and you're trying to stop it from going further. However, it seems to me the important place is up in on the site, and so much of tonight's presentation had to do with off-site. And so I'm still having trouble with that. So I want to go back. I want to hear the presentations again and the justification for all the things that we're doing. And from that, I will try and wrap my mind around this conceptual site model as it's been presented and accepted through collaboration. And that's why I would like to know the discussions that went on, because I think they're important. And if we don't have any way of seeing what those discussions involved, then I think the public's been left out of an important process. Tom, do you have any comment on this?
I was able to hear it fine, but Dietrich mentioned that usually in a conceptual site model, it's defined by the area of contamination. I'd like to ask that this conceptual site model evaluation why, I guess, and Dietrich, maybe you can help me here. Are you saying that the North End needs to be included within the actual Lowry Landfill Superfund site? The North End plume?
I think that's an ongoing question. I just on how it's being managed. The language in the document, it really could be cleaned up a little bit using historic boundary versus site. I'm not sure how EPA views it as a site because so much of it is part of that plume. Similar sites with similar problems in Region 9 did require some definition of where, the extent of what the actual site was and how it was managed. And I don't know if this call is the best time to go into the weeds on that one, but it does make review of the documents a little more challenging. And it's complicated further by just that extent of the north-south extent of the plume going through some different geology. And on the site, on the historical site, on the facility itself, we have a lot of more deeper wells. We have a lot more thorough assessment. We can go back to from its original assessment 20, 30 years ago that we don't have on that north end, yet that north end of the site is just a huge chunk of where the risk is and other things. So it just complicates this review, and it's one of the things that's never really been fished out for the site. And that, I guess that's my 2 cents on the overview, just trying to get through these documents right now. And the only one we've really read through is, or started to read through, is the updated conceptual site model. But I think on that same note regarding site management, a question for Linda. How will these comments be included in the current 5-year review in progress? I mean, having these two things overlap is a little bit of the challenge, I think, for the citizens involved, because it's a lot of activity where there's not been much before. To have these two things overlap. Are these comments provided this to the group that's doing the 5-year review?
So if you want a comment to be considered for the 5-year review, it would have to go on the interview form to SKIO. And then the comments on these 2 particular documents will be considered for those documents. Obviously, if there's something that overlaps with the 5-year review, you know, we will look at that. But if you want your official comment recorded for the 5-year review, that would have to go in the interview form to SKIO.
Is this something that SKIO would review as a matter of process, or is it kept from them if it's not attached to those forms?
They're only going to be looking at what's on the forms, and then they will also get input from the EPA team too. So if there was some major oversight that we saw or found through this process on something, that information would be shared with SKIO by our EPA team.
All right, so I mean, it's,
Yeah, so we
assume that things are pretty open to SKIO.
Right. We really wanted to get these documents out now because we are in the 5-year review process. So that's why they came out together, so that you had the opportunity to look at them and use them to help formulate some of your comments on the 5-year review.
Okay. CDPHE then has already provided their comments, and this document is, there's not going to be additional comments from the other agencies?
No, the agencies have all commented on it.
Okay. And then EPA is the only one that's going to respond to comments that that come to you then. CDPHE is not going to respond to them?
So it's going to be similar to the consolidated comment process that we used with the North End investigation. So you all provided comments on that. My technical team went through those and commented on them. We do run those by CDPHE to make sure that they're comfortable with some of our comments. And so it's very similar to that other process that we used before. So we provided kind of line by line what your comments were they incorporated, were they not, and the rationale why. So that was about 1.5 years ago. So you might not, I mean, I know you work on a lot of projects, and so you might not remember that exact memo that came out from EPA, but we'll do that for these too.
I'm just trying to get an idea of the role of the other agencies. I'm familiar with the process and what you're speaking of. Is there going to be an opportunity to go through preliminary comments with the other technical folks on the team? Are any of those arrangements being considered?
I'm not completely sure what your question is. On what team?
Is there going to be any technical meetings to review preliminary comments on these documents?
There are none scheduled right now. No.
Would you be interested in scheduling any?
I don't, we haven't thought that far ahead. So I guess it depends what the comments are that come back in and what they require, what type of review. You know, is it something that my technical team can answer? So we'll see once the comments come in.
We have about an hour, not quite, but to have the CAG dig into any place in the document. And I know, Bonnie, the presentation didn't come through, but if there are places in the document that people have questions or concerns or want to raise items that you can later fully formulate into comments on the conceptual site model document, this is a time, not the only time, but a time to dig in.
So I would like to say that I do remember what Linda's talking about, where the CAG's comments were reviewed, and then EPA let us know which ones were incorporated, which ones weren't, and I guess why. And that was very helpful. And I would like the same thing to be done with all of CDPHE's comments and Tri-County Health's comments, so that we could know which ones you accepted, which ones you rejected, and why. It seems to me that's the same very public process. So is that not going to happen?
Colleen, do you want to speak to that? I mean, for the most part, all of CDPHE's comments were incorporated.
Yeah, that is correct. So this process was a little bit different. We were involved in an initial draft review, and then we had a bunch of technical meetings where we talked through our questions, our comments, areas we thought needed to be dug into more. And so we worked through all of those through several months of meetings and looking at red line documents, and our requested revisions were all addressed to our satisfaction. So we're pretty comfortable with the way the document sits right now. It's not something where we can kind of create we had this issue, this is the resolution type thing, because it was a lot of technical discussions and, does this make sense? Does this answer your question? Digging into old documents, that kind of thing. So it's hard to reproduce where we started versus where we ended up with the document from the standpoint of our comments. But I think a good summary is that, as we worked through the documents, questions that we had were answered, concerns we had were addressed, and where the document ended up, we're pretty comfortable with it.
And from what you're just saying, I completely agree with that was a working through process. And that's what we've been missing, is the opportunity to see the working through. We just see the final product, and as you all well know, we're not always happy with that. It would be so much better for us if we could understand what was worked through in order to come out with the final result. And so I guess I'd like to ask then Tri-County Health, do they feel like their processes were all worked out? And if we could see what was suggested by them and what EPA accepted and what they rejected, that would be great as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, say the same thing that Colleen said, Margie, is that we were jointly in these groups. And so all of our comments were addressed at the time and incorporated. And so we felt that our comments were.
So I would like to ask if we could please clarify, Linda. I remember when the community was invited to come to these meetings. I can give you the minutes from those meetings when EPA used to meet, and WSDs were there, and CDPHE and Tri-County, and we could hear the process. Please explain to us again why the community is not allowed to listen to these discussions any longer.
So, I mean, what you were talking about is way before my time. So when I started, we had the technical agency meetings facilitated by Keith Takata. And through that, before my time, that was determined to be an agency meeting because they were deliberative talks about things. And so that continued on. A lot of this is line by line, tedious, you missed a period here, on your figure, you forgot something. So it took us a long time to go through this, but there are deliberative talks between EPA and the work settling defendants that we have under the consent decree. It's a legal proceeding.
Okay. That still doesn't explain why the community is not allowed to hear the discussion. For instance, as I talked when we were setting the agenda, as I explained to Colleen, I'm just confused by the fact that the state has authority over states' waters. And we're having this big discussion now about OU1 and OU6, and has the Denver aquifer been impacted? And we still have people trying to say, no, Denver isn't impacted. And we're having all of these discussions, and yet Colleen wrote an excellent letter to one of the council people from City of Aurora, explaining what he had been told at a meeting And that was that the Denver has been impacted in certain areas. And so what we're concerned about here is because we can't hear the conversation with the state having the authority on protecting states' waters. They've already done an NRD settlement over the plume, the offsite plume. And so now we're having this discussion about whether the Denver's been impacted or not. And we're confused about how in the CSM and everything that we're looking at now, how we can talk about a cross-contamination of aquifers that's happened, and yet everybody's comfortable with the CSM the way it reads. And I'm really confused how the state can be comfortable with this decision, where the north end, the water in the north end is, we all know, different from water on site with Section 6. And so there's this definite undercurrent of how we describe, how anyone describes the Denver versus the Dawson. And the information that we've been receiving leads us to comment on this CSM that the Denver has been tainted, okay? We're not gonna argue to what degree, but our concern is what discussion was had with EPA and the WSDs in which it was determined that the state was comfortable with the Denver in the condition that it's in right now, in the position and the information we know for sure. How, I would love to know why the state is comfortable with that. And I think there's restrictions being put on everybody in the agencies, preventing anyone from talking about this openly with the public. And it's just bothersome. And that's what these discussions between EPA and the state could really clear up for us. Maybe we could better understand. But right now we don't. And it's really hard for us to sit and listen to this and have people say to us, well, it's confidential, it's litigation, so on and so forth under the 2005 consent decree. However, the only thing that matters to us in this is the ROD, what the ROD says. And right now we're not meeting what the ROD requires. And yet everything, we're still moving forward as though everything's fine. And this is really confusing. And that's why if we could be a part and parcel of the discussion, maybe we could understand better.
I got a comment real quick, or a question. So on the consent agreement, does the consent agreement specifically state that the citizens may not become a part of any of the discussions in reference to what's being done at the site? Not the money, but what's being done and what is acceptable by EPA and what's not, those meetings. Does it say we cannot be there?
So the consent decree says to follow the community relations plan, which was in effect back then. Oh, and Steve has his hand up. Maybe you can answer that too. So now we have the community involvement plan, and we've been following that for the site. And there's 3 opportunities to give feedback depending on the situation. One is any document you can provide comments to. 2 is the public review period, and 3 is the public comment period. And those are above and beyond what we do at other sites. And so I'm gonna turn it over to Steve because he has his hand raised.
Well, I just want to say, why do we have to accept what you've changed? Why do we have to accept that? Why can't we go back and do what we did before? Why has it changed?
We just updated the community. We just went through a big process and we had you guys comment on it, and that's where we got. But
okay.
we just updated that. So last year. Steve?
Thanks, Linda. Okay, looks like I got my camera on there. Thank you. Yeah, two quick thoughts. Hopefully part of it's responsive to the last couple of comments. The settlement agreement was in fact a type of watershed moment, for the site, and it did definitely change how we worked with all of the parties that were involved. And of course, the work settling defendants are, as the name implies, a subset of a much larger group that we originally were in conversations with years ago about trying to figure out the conditions at the site, who was going to do the work, who would be financially responsible. So took a lot of effort from a lot of people to get to that point. That enforcement agreement does carry with it, or bring with it, some expectations in terms of how the parties are going to work together. And when I say parties here, I'm primarily talking about EPA, the state of Colorado, and the work settling defendants. So we as regulators, co-regulators, do collaborate. We do talk about things that are confidential in terms of the potential outcome. And we generally say those things are deliberative. In other words, we're thinking about an issue, we're trying to come to a decision, but we haven't reached that yet. So we keep those things internal. And no, we don't share those with the public. Now, does that apply to every single thing we do? No. And there are definite processes, steps that we take at any Superfund site where we do open that up and we invite public comment and we have a formal comment period. We do produce responsiveness summaries where we explain, this is what we received, this is how we reacted to that, and change things or did not change things as a result of that. At this site, we have those formal processes in place, but we've gone beyond that, as we were just talking about, and tried to open it up even farther to the community. So I know that doesn't satisfy everyone, in terms of the transparency or perceived transparency, for some of the things that we're doing. But I guess I would turn the question around a little bit and ask Bonnie and others how they think the outcome would be different if both EPA, the state, Tri-County, and others are here saying, we discussed things in detail, we went back and forth, we had agreements, disagreements, we sorted all that out. But we're here now explaining all of that. I guess my question would be, how would things look different if some subset of the community, whether it's the CAG or whomever, was sitting in the room, was a fly on the wall during those conversations? How then would you think the outcome would be different, I guess?
Me personally, I think it would help with my understanding. And there have been
Can't hear you, Margie.
Oh, sorry. Is this any better?
Yep.
Okay. I said it would help with my understanding if I were to be able to sit in a room and hear those discussions. I am not a highly technical person, so it helps me to hear various perspectives, and then something triggers a bell in my head that says, oh, that's what that means, or that's why they did that. I don't know if it would change anything that EPA decides to do, but it would potentially help me to understand why you're making the decisions you're making. Because right now, I mean, for an example, the very last slide on the conceptual site model, I think the last bullet point was, there's no problem on the north end. Well, what that triggered in my head immediately was, oh, there's no problem there on that one little spot, but the whole rest of the site is in big trouble. But we're not going to say that because we're just going to concentrate on this one thing. If I were to hear the discussions that led to that statement on that slide that said there's no problem on the north end, I would either know that there's no problem anywhere, or yep, there's something fishy going on and there's just no problem on the north end. Let's tell them that.
So Tom, I've got you in, and then Bonnie wants in as well. I'm also going to encourage you all to not only talk about process things, not that they don't matter, they matter enormously, but also dig into the substantive things. Bonnie, you mentioned the groundwater earlier. I'm in section 8 of the conceptual site model that talks about the evaluation of on-site exposure pathways. So would love to have you all dig into the CSM as well. So Tom.
Steve, just a quick answer to your question. It would help me because then I would know that some of the concerns that I particularly have, like having a very narrow rapid pathway at MW113 EW1 of 10 to 40 feet would have been evaluated for such things as fluvial lag deposits that may be an area where you have a much faster flow of contaminants, and then investigating it further with something like having high resolution site characterization with emergent contaminants. Have you considered using that at the north end to see that you're really following the pathway that is carrying the 1,4-dioxane out of there, and you're actually seeing what's happening? So basically, you know, if the questions come up and they're discussed intelligently, and I hear how they're discussed, it would help me to feel better about how you got to the conclusions and to trust what you're saying in a very summarized document like you have now. But and as far as Mike is concerned, I think that there's several things that I can address specifically on the document. For making clarity, an example on the geologic hydrology section of the document, which is 4. They have 2 sets of not slides, but basically diagrams, and one of them is 1 through 12, and one of them is 1 through 19. And throughout that document, even though the numbers, there's a 1-1 in the first section, and there's 1-1 in the other of the diagrams, like something like this. They don't clearly tell you which one they're talking about. Number 2 is definitions need to be clear, and this is something that Dietrich was talking about, but I'll give you a specific example. On page 4-6, the last paragraph, it says shallow groundwater at the site is defined as groundwater within the alluvium and the weathered bedrock in the upper Dawson Formation within the site boundaries. Well, there's conflicting definitions of that throughout your document. Let's see, on paragraph, on page 4-5, it states that it's only the alluvium and the weathered Dawson, but it's also the weathered Dawson that's included in OU1. And then on figure pardon me, page 4-2, it says that the difference between OU1 and OU2 is a separation layer, which would mean that it also includes the upper, they call it upper Denver, and they don't even define as upper Denver weathered or unweathered. And then if you go to figure 4.8, showing the separation layer, that shows it's the unweathered Denver's there. So definitions need to be clear when you're talking about this. And then I would even go further and say that when you're talking, well, I'll quit there. It's too much information. I'll let somebody else go on.
Okay, Tom, get back in if you need. Bonnie.
Yeah. Tom, I don't think it was too much information. That's what we're discussing, and I think it was good, so thank you for all that. Steve, I'd like to answer your question, what difference would it make? Well, the difference it would make is if the community or the citizens were involved in the discussion that was going to lead to final decisions, you wouldn't have the public constantly criticizing and challenging the way we are right now. And I think that would be the most beneficial to EPA, maybe not to the WSDs, but if we have this discussion and we can list our concerns at these meetings, in the past, it has made a difference. And we have heard the discussion, and have things gone ahead as EPA and the WSDs want it to anyway? Yeah, sometimes, but at least it was in the open what our concerns were. And what I'm finding, I'm more and more concerned about all this focus on the north end, and there's nothing, in my opinion, has been settled by EPA focusing on and spending all their funds on the north end investigation, and in fact having a risk assessment done so that it would, when the public reads the report, it'll say everything's fine down there. Well, the people who live in gun club estates don't necessarily agree with that. We'd like to see some testing done to bring that about. There's been no real investigation on Mississippi at the north end. We know that the wells are 300 feet apart. We know the plume is only 40 feet wide according to EPA and the WSDs. Well, that means that a 40-foot wide plume can go in between a 300-foot well, and we have no idea what's happening on the north side of those wells. That's really disconcerting. And I would like to bring that up at a meeting when we're talking with EPA and CDPHE. These are important things. Also, the chemicals of concern. The north end, as far as I can understand from some of the studies that have been done, the north end water situation is really a strange thing for anyone to deal with because we have no clear evidence of what's happening past the wells at Mississippi. So we have no idea what chemicals of contamination might be going through there. We have no idea on man-made preferential pathways in that area. That was not part of the study. And when the WSDs come out with their reports, it always seems to be a projection of numbers, not actually actual data that shows us. And if we were part of these meetings, we could say to the WSDs, but these are just projections that are saying it looks like everything's going to be okay if we do this. And that's really disconcerting. So if we really had a handle on what was said in the meetings and who was recommending what, and maybe if the EPA was more receptive to, or let's say the WSDs were more receptive to the public being involved in these meetings, knowing that we may disagree with some of the things that are said, I think that the meetings could still be productive. but not if you don't want someone holding you back in your decision, which the community may feel is an arbitrary decision. But at least you would know. And I don't think that what's been going on with EPA since we formed this CAG and the community has been productive. I think it's been upsetting for everyone. I'm sure it's driving EPA crazy. It's driving us crazy. And I don't see that we've accomplished a lot. And that's not our fault. We have tried to ask questions. We have tried to make comment, and we've been rebuffed in a lot of ways. And now we have some restrictions put on what we can and can't do and how often we have to report because we were naughty kids and now we're going to be punished. Well, what good does that really do? I'll follow whatever rules EPA tells me to follow. I always have. But my point is, we're not cooperating in any way, shape, or form. And the CAG would really much prefer that somehow we could be included in things so we're not sitting back here asking these questions that sound challenging and ugly. But what choice do we have? Where else do we go? And so that's what good I think it would be if we could be involved in these discussions and if we could hear what the WSDs are saying. We'd like to hear what Tri-County is saying. We don't know where they're standing now, and yet Lisa sent out the email to us saying this is a collaboration between CDPHE and Tri-County and EPA. Well, that's a little disconcerting to me because I have heard that Tri-County was saying at one point, nobody's drinking the water. We haven't done testing. Who knows? Nobody is. 2 houses aren't going to prove anything. And secondly, at one point, it was being said that the homes in Gun Club Estates, the leach detection systems are causing the 1,4-dioxane plume. Now, how could that be? The plume comes from 3 miles uphill north. And I don't understand that. Maybe if I could be involved in the meetings, I could understand it, but I'm not. So I think that's where we get a lot of animosity and we get a lot of distrust. And that's what I think, attending the meetings and hearing what's being said in the discussion, that's where I think it might do some good, Steve.
Thanks, Bonnie. And I thank you for bringing up the trust issue because underneath a lot of this, I think that is kind of a fundamental issue that everybody needs to work on, to try to improve. So I appreciate that.
Hey, thank you.
So let me see if there are other specific comments on the CSM. If there are any agency responses to some of the things that were on Bonnie's list, from well testing to the use of projections instead of actual figures for certain things that are in the model. Any responses there? Shall we let other CAG members step in, offer your observations on the document or questions you have about it?
Well, a number of our CAG members are not able to join the meeting tonight. But I think Tom and I we've had our work study sessions and Tom and I are representing their concerns as well. Margie has been very vocal. Thank you, Margie. I appreciate it. Everything you've said is right on target. And Dietrich, do you have any suggestions at all, or are we just going to move forward? And I have asked EPA, since we have new rules and guidelines for how our CAG can operate, I've asked EPA to give us an outline of, since the rules now say that Dietrich will only be allowed to focus on operable units 1 and operable units 6. I've asked EPA to give us, number 1, we have to ask for permission to review these 2 draft documents. I sent an email asking permission from CISA today. And then I asked him to give us a chart of what Dietrich, what he will approve as project officer, what he will approve for Dietrich to review. And then I've asked for an outline from our project manager and the EPA team on if Dietrich can only focus on operable units 1 and 6, since they're so tied to so much else going on the site, how is he supposed to handle commenting on OU 1 and 6 when it impacts and has an effect on another part of the site? So we're going to wait for EPA to give us that outline. Dietrich, do you have any suggestions? Do you have anything that you need to add or ask of EPA?
No, I think we have to wait for that clarification. I think particularly in the case of the conceptual site model, it far exceeds more than just a groundwater discussion. There will be comments on how it's developed. The document goes through history and everything else that obviously would be part of any thorough review. I would just implore EPA to clarify these administrative issues as quickly as possible, that they will be required in order for the group to meet any deadline. So that would be my only input on it. We're getting a slow start because of some of this. As I read through it, I just see that it's going to be, we're just going to have it. It may be something as simple as, that these directions include any comments that are derived from the conceptual site model and the other, the documents at hand presently. So, but then again, unfortunately, Bonnie, a lot of that's going to that's going to be the correspondence you have between yourself and CSA, and I just look forward to those directions from you, reflecting what EPA is telling you they want.
Okay, we will be moving forward. We'll be waiting for EPA to respond to how we're supposed to handle this. I think another advantage to having the public involved earlier and in the meetings and so on is that anything that Dietrich is not allowed to talk about, we will not be able to present scientifically technical response to EPA. I think that's a loss for EPA. If Dietrich is not allowed to respond, we're going to respond as an individual citizens group. And we're not always going to make it as technically concise and understandable. I think that's how we'll have to do it, because if EPA says, no, Dietrich isn't allowed to comment on this and you can't pay him, then we're left holding the dirty bag of saying to Dietrich, sorry, Dietrich, we can't pay you. So we're going to be very, very careful on what we do. And if Dietrich's not allowed to do the work on it, then we as individual citizens will comment. We'll do our best, but I guarantee you it will not be as professional or easily read as what Dietrich could do. And I think that's a disservice to EPA and to the citizenry.
So for the EPA folks, I'm not sure I fully understand this last part of the conversation. So let me just ask a question which might make no sense. Is there anything that stands in the way of Dietrich assisting the CAG to comment on the conceptual site model in order to meet the July 6th public comment?
We don't know yet. I sent this, we don't know yet. I'm waiting for CSA to answer my email today, asking him what Dietrich can work on in those 2 documents. He is only to focus on operable units 1 and operable unit 6. However, those 2 units are very co-mingled with everything else going on at the site. So since we are not to allow Dietrich to do any work for us outside those two items, we had to ask CSA today, please clarify what portions of the 2 draft documents will Dietrich be approved to work on. When I get that information from EPA, then we will give Dietrich a go-ahead.
I could be wrong, but and please correct me if I am, but my thinking is that Mike was trying to
Can't hear you, Margie.
I said, my thinking is that Mike was trying to possibly shortcut that process by asking EPA tonight. And I could be wrong, but that was my interpretation of what you were trying to say, Mike.
Thanks, Margie. I just want to know if there really, if there is in fact a real barrier to the July 6th deadline. That's all. To the CAG having Dietrich in order to meet the July 6th deadline.
No, I don't see how there's any shortcut. I don't see what can be done. I don't see, unless Linda says to us right now, okay, we're going to remove all your restrictions, but I don't think she's going to do that tonight. But if she does, we'll be perfectly happy. That'll remove any impediments. Until that point, we have to have in writing direction from EPA.
I asked Linda that question then.
Right, so it's part of the terms and conditions. And so this is really our Sisay's area, but since he's not here, under the new terms and conditions, work needs to be pre-approved. So like Bonnie said, she sent an email over to Sisay saying this is the work that we would like Dietrich to work on. Is this pre-approved? So I know that his group has been looking at that email, and there should be an email back shortly. And then that way, you know, for sure that that money will be reimbursable, and then there's no questions, you know, going forward, that you know that that will get reimbursed for.
Mm-hmm.
Linda, can I ask Dietrich a question about the conceptual site model during this presentation? Or is that going to be not that I can't do that?
I think Dietrich attending CAG meetings is, you know, a reimbursable item.
Okay, so you're saying yes then. Dietrich, I was wondering if you might want to comment on whether or not the particle tracking, which seems to be based on piezometry readings and being based on extraction well drawdown cones rather than whether or not that's enough information in order to give accurate particle tracking, or should there be other data that's included in the particle tracking?
I can only speak to that generally, in that my first, just going through a little bit through the conceptual site model and the prep for the call today, we don't see any discussion of seasonal data and a lot of one snapshot data. So I think on particle tracking in general, we'd like to see that done on a larger data set, and consider seasonal changes in groundwater flow and groundwater elevation. So that's kind of a preliminary response to that, kind of coached with the idea that we're still in the review process.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I'm a little confused by Tom's question and Dietrich's answer. The particle tracking that was discussed in the first presentation was part of the containment system evaluation for the north boundary barrier wall. It's not part of the conceptual site model. So I want to make sure that we are keeping those separate. They're separate documents and a separate review.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the north end conception, north end model, they basically, in the conceptual site model, they say that the north end is containing things appropriately, and that's based on particle tracking. So that's why I brought that question up, because I don't think that particle tracking, but I'm not a scientist, but I don't think the particle tracking data was enough of a data set in order to have actual good particle tracking. Another question that I had was with the flow models and so on. And again, that's part of the whole conceptual site. Those flow lines and some of those drawings show that a flow line for the particle tracking showed that the particles went through the north boundary barrier wall. I don't understand how that can happen unless you've got to tell the model what things are acceptable or not in order to calibrate it. And I would like to see some data that Dietrich could look at and say the controls that that were put on it in order to be able to calibrate the model were appropriate. And you know, if I had been in the meetings and I saw that they did that, I wouldn't even have to be asking that question. I'd have much more faith on what was going on.
So Tom, we're lucky to have Paul Orsosco here with us today. And so I'm going to ask Paul, I'm kind of putting you in a spot. Can you give some insight to like the overall methodology of the particle tracking and the data used and like how that was put together and how the models were created? Am I putting you on the spot too much, Paul?
No, I'll,
okay, thank you.
I hadn't planned on, because you said we'd not be discussing this tonight, but so the model was developed and the calibration was performed well in advance of doing the evaluations. There was actually a report issued, I think it was about 2 years ago, that had the model development and calibration information. And then the model was then used, once we got the work plan approval as to how to do the CSE, the model was then used to do the particle tracks. So the particle tracks were not based on the water levels. They were based on the model, which takes the water levels, the hydraulic conductivity and everything, and integrates it into a three-dimensional flow system. And then puts the particle tracks in that. And we ran the particle tracks in a variety of layers to look at how they all were captured. We showed you plan views today. There are no particles that go past the target zone of containment. I think you may have been thinking of the flow vector arrows that we showed. Well, there's no particles that go past the target zone of containment. They all stop there. So that's basically it. We can spend more time on that. I think we're going to speak about this in an upcoming meeting. Is that correct, Linda?
To be determined.
Okay. Well, I guess when we get your comments, we can look at them and try to respond to them.
Yeah. So, Tom, anything else, or Bonnie, anything else on the substance of this before I ask some? Well, what do we do with all this now, given where you are?
Yes, Paul. What about MW113 EW1, where there's a very narrow primary pathway of 10 to 40 feet? What has been done in order to tell where that primary pathway is going? And in other words, it may be a lag deposit. You know, it's something that has very little restriction to flow. So has that been is there any attempt made to define that with seismic reflection or anything else? And see where that goes. And then once you see where that pathway goes, then you could better place a monitoring well, and you could better place an extraction well to make sure that things aren't escaping from there.
Okay. Again, I think this is a little beyond what we were going to plan on talking about today, but the MW113 is beyond the target zone of containment. So what we looked at, working, with the agencies, the target zone of containment was defined to be the north boundary barrier wall, that line that we showed in the video. So we looked at the containment there. We did not look at using the model at that stage as part of the CSE for whether there was a better location for an extraction well, like you're saying. What we did do, though, to answer, I think, your underlying question, is we took all the geologic data and the water level data and the water quality data, and we generated a definition of a sand unit in the weathered and the unweathered bedrock based on any occurrences of sand. And we did not try to differentiate them vertically. When we were in the unweathered, we took sands that were in layer 4 and layer 3, and we consolidated them and said, we'll just assume that they're connected. And we'll assume that the union of all these sand occurrences are somehow connected. So we took what we felt was a very conservative approach, rather than saying, okay, we have a little sand channel over here, a lag deposit, we have another one over here. We just assumed everything was connected in order to do the analysis, to be conservative. So that's how we addressed the uncertainty that I think you're trying to get at, as to how we handled that pathway. So.
Okay, we're about to run out of time. So I think for the last few minutes, I'm just gonna ask Bonnie and Tom to think out loud, if you're willing, about what you do next month. And now everybody's gonna get to watch me shoot myself right in the foot. So here goes. I've taken the weapon out and I'm aiming at my toe. It was my suggestion, actually, it was my question to Janine before this meeting began about whether she thought it might make sense, just we were having idle conversation, to leave the CAG to its own with Dietrich, presuming that that's approved, for the June meeting, for these 2 hours, without WSDs and regulatory agencies and review agencies, in order that you might spend more time on your questions and comments before the comment deadline on July 6th. And therefore, this array of people with all these letters after their names might be dismissed for purposes of your next meeting, in order to give the CAG all the time that you might need to meet together and deliberate and assemble your comments before they go in on July 6th. So there you go. So I think that's, if I were sitting in your seat, Bonnie and Tom, that's what I would do. That's what I would want. But it's quite possible that I am completely misguided. So what do you want to do next month is my question. And now you have my suggestion on top of it. And there's a hole in my foot, I'm sure. So go ahead.
My opinion is that there are plenty of people with PhDs and other listings after their name that I love meeting with, and I don't care about that. Learned a lot from those kind of people, and I like discussing these things with those kind of people. Whether we need to have a meeting with everybody next month, I'm sure that most of the people that are on this screen tonight have had enough meetings. Probably would be happy if they could miss one. I would like to have a little bit of time to talk to the board as a whole in a work study session so we can discuss this. I promise we'll do that within this next week and get back with you. I have no problem with not having a meeting if we're not going to have our comment done, which we won't. But I do request a big meeting that focuses on comments that come in after the July 6th deadline. I want to hear I want to be able to see people's comments. I want to be able to review them. And I want to know right now where we can receive any kind of comments that have come in so far. We'd like that made public. And so right now I'm mute on whether we have a meeting next month or not. I know most of you would prefer not to. It takes a lot of your time to come to these, but we appreciate it. Yes. Tom, what are your thoughts?
I think that the CAG can have its own meetings on deciding what things we want to talk about. We don't have to take up and take away our time from being able to have community meetings with everybody.
So you're up for not having a meeting next month?
No, I think that we need to have a meeting. We need to, we need to ask the questions. We need to, between now and then, we need to develop what questions we need to ask. And we need to ask them while our comment period is still open.
Okay, I like that idea. Margie, you're on. What do you think?
I would like for the other
Can't hear
people-
you.
Sorry, is that any better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I would like for some of the other people who are on this call, maybe from the other agencies, maybe from the general public, if there are any, I would like to hear what their thoughts were about these two documents.
Okay, you would like that at the next meeting?
Well, because I guess there's no time now for it, then yeah.
Okay, I like that idea. Maggie, are you still on? I don't.
I'm still here. I just have carrots in my mouth.
Okay, what do you think? What's your opinion? What do you think?
I think we should have the meeting because there may be things that we need to have answers to. So I think the experts need to be there and available to us prior to the closing of the review period so that we can get those answers. Because we can review and get the technical expertise that we need. Hopefully, you know, if we get approved to do that from Dietrich in the meantime.
Okay. Rudy and Mary, what are your opinion? Whoop.
Well, having a little difficulty there. No, I'm in agreement with what everyone is saying. That we should have the meeting.
Okay. Looks like the majority would like to have the meeting, Mike, so I think that's where we'll stand. Did I miss any other CAG members? I don't think so.
Well, Bonnie, the other thing is if we can't or don't talk about this, when are we going to just talk about the questions that Tom has raised and the questions that Molly raised from their papers? So
Right.
It's not like if we don't talk about this, we can't talk about anything. I think we have plenty of things we could talk about.
So, Margie, as I said earlier, those are going to be included in the comments for these documents. So because we have so many things that we're receiving comments on, they're all just going to be collected and then we're going to respond to them later. So if there may be some questions that you guys have in June that we won't be able to answer, we need to have them far enough ahead of time for the experts to, you know, do some review and pull some information. So I unless you have them to us a couple weeks before, I don't know that we'll be able to answer all your questions at that meeting.
I'm sure that we can get some questions and we can get them to you.
Can't hear you, Richard.
You can't hear me?
No.
I'm saying that I agree that we will be able to come up with some questions for you, Linda, and we'll be able to present them to you in time for review so you can give us some answers. We never come short.
Yeah, right.
Never.
Richard, I apologize. You must be my husband. I didn't ask your opinion.
Well,
I'm sorry.
You hear too much of it. And I'd like to say the presentations for this guy, my blood's coming out my ears.
I'm
Blood's
sorry.
coming out my ears.
Okay, let's say that the CAG right now wants to have another meeting. I appreciate your thoughts about that. Would give us some time to work along with Dietrich, but we do that on a regular basis. So I have no problem with that meeting, and we think that we have plenty, and we can talk to you more, Michael, you and Janine and Lisa about the meeting that's coming up. And I don't think that we can expect any answers that night from EPA folks. I mean, we can't. I mean, we still don't have answers to our letters. So maybe that could be a subject. I don't know. But we're not going to have a problem with the subject because we got plenty of things we can talk about, and we don't need an answer from EPA that night, but we want to pose these thoughts to EPA so that we can look forward to an answer later, maybe.
So CAG will meet between now and the June meeting. If you have questions framed and those can go to EPA in advance of the June meeting, then that will be helpful so that they know what's on your mind and what questions you have. We have a June meeting where the exchange about these two documents can happen, and some of the CAG discussion can be overheard by regulatory and review agencies. And Tom and Bonnie and Janine and Lisa and I will get together and work on an agenda.
Yes, one last question for Linda. I know that the CAG has been contacted by Lisa about an interview with our CAG group for the
5-year review.
5-year review. And you were saying something about there needs to be papers filled out?
No, you have an option. You can do the verbal interview, like a community a group interview, an individual interview, and Skia will take notes on that.
Okay.
Or you can also submit written comments too. So there's many options for that.
Okay, that sounds good. Michael, you see Dietrich's suggestion in the chat. Everybody, Dietrich gave a suggestion in the chat thing, and so I'm sure everything will go just fine, but we want to have our CAG meeting. So thank you. So guess it's time to make a motion, the meeting come to a close. Anybody second? Nobody's gonna second? Oh, Rudy and Mary did. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Take care, folks.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
All right.
Night.